I didn't see you, but I hear you.
I am here.
That's great.
Hi,
All
Julia.
right. Well, everyone is here. And I am thrilled to get us started. So thank you all for being here. Hello, and welcome to the 2021 Gifted Education Policy Symposium and Conference, hosted by the Office of the Daniel L. Ritchie Endowed Chair in Gifted Education at the Morgridge College of Education at the University of Denver. And we are so pleased to welcome you today. The vision for the work embodied by the Endowed Chair includes a future in which giftedness will be understood, embraced, and systematically nurtured throughout the nation and the world. I am Norma Hassenstein, the Daniel L. Ritchie Endowed Chair in Gifted Education, and it is indeed my pleasure to extend warmest greetings and welcome to this opportunity to learn together. Designed for teacher leaders, building and district leaders, researchers, parents, mental health professionals, and education service providers, our conference this year in February, Black History Month, is focused on addressing disproportionality in gifted education. And we are pleased to serve as host to leading educators and researchers joining with all of us to explore together gifted education from multiple perspectives and to urge each of us to become stronger advocates, taking the next step to support all gifted learners. The University of Denver is committed to all gifted learners and to those who educate and support them. The Morgridge College of Education is home to the Rick Center for Gifted Children, a school serving preschool through 8th grade gifted learners, graduate programs in gifted education, including a full course for all pre-service teachers, a full course, not just 2 clock hours, a master's degree, doctoral level programs, including the EDD and the PhD with either gifted or twice exceptional specializations. And we look forward to welcoming a new cohort of doctoral students this coming summer. There's still time to apply for those of you who might be interested. Currently, we're partnering with 2 local districts to provide additional professional learning opportunities in equitable gifted education. And in 2020, we were awarded a Jacob K. Javits federal grant to increase identification of and service to traditionally underrepresented gifted students across 4 sites in rural Colorado. We are pleased to have you here, and our conference is made possible by the generosity of many. First, I want to thank the Considine Family Foundation for their ongoing support and generosity and deep dedication to gifted learners. Thank you to our Emerald sponsors, the Colorado Association for Gifted and Talented, Gifted Unlimited, Gifted Unlimited's Talent Search, the Center for Gifted Studies at Western Kentucky University, and the World Council for Gifted and Talented Children. And to our Ruby sponsors, the Colorado Academy of Educators for the Gifted, Talented, and Creative, JAH Consulting, the National Association for Gifted Children, Rick Center for Gifted Children, Sierra Gifted Educational Services, and the G-Word Film. Thank you to Morgridge College of Education Dean, Dr. Karen Riley, and Teaching and Learning Sciences Department Chair, Dr. Rashida Banerjee. I'd like to extend a special thank you to Joy Lynn for her tireless work and expertise in coordination of this conference, and to our numerous alumni and graduate students who are serving as room hosts and technical support. We are truly grateful. The Policy Symposium is a highlight of our work together each year, and the insights and inspiration shared by our distinguished panelists motivates each of us to action. As our presenters share, please feel free to post questions in the chat, and our room host will share with the moderator. So it is truly my pleasure and honor indeed to have with us an evening of most distinguished panel of experts addressing policy to support equitable identification of and service to gifted learners. Moderated this evening by Dr. Julia Link Roberts. Dr. Roberts is the Maheron Professor of Gifted Studies at the Center for Gifted Studies at Western Kentucky University. Our panelists include Dr. Dina Brulles, Director of Gifted Education at the Paradise Valley Unified School District, Dr. Marcia Gentry, Professor, Educational Studies and Director, Gifted Education Research and Resource Institute, Purdue University, Dr. Scott Peters, Professor of Assessment and Research Methodology, University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, and Dr. Jonathan Plucker, Julian C. Stanley Professor of Talent Development, Johns Hopkins University, and current President, National Association for Gifted Children. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished Policy Symposium panel.
Thank you so much, Norma. The parenting session was very informative, and the parent voices certainly highlighted the need for policy in many respects. Policy makes it possible for decisions to be made not on a case-by-case basis, but because there is policy in place. Policy lays the foundation for what can happen in schools for gifted children, and it makes it possible to implement best practices without a huge hassle, but all that policy is not currently in place. As you all know well, policy doesn't spring into place. It's something that you work hard to get in place. And occasionally, policy shows up in negative ways, and it only takes a word or two or a phrase in legislation to make that policy negative for gifted children. Having this session focused on policy is very important, and we have panelists with deep experience in policy work. We have 3 primary questions for panelists to discuss. I will ask one prompt at a time, and then I'll call on each panelist because we're going to vary the order. Each panelist will respond in approximately 5 minutes to answer each question. After all 3 prompts, we will have time for participants to ask questions, and then we'll wrap up with advice and final remarks for panelists. So let's go with our first prompt. Please share an example of an exemplar policy that supports or fails to support gifted students at each of these levels: local, state, and national. Scott, we'll start with you.
Well, good evening. Thank you, Julia, and thank you to Norma and everyone for having me. It's really a privilege listening to all the biographies to be included on this panel. I was looking at some of my notes and realizing I should have started off with maybe a more positive answer, but one of the things I'm going to share is kind of a positive and kind of a negative, but at the local level, I think getting rid of mandatory referrals before students can be considered for advanced learning programs. So you could see that as kind of a positive or a negative, but removing that hurdle of needing to please a particular educator who may or may not know the student well, may or may not be culturally competent, may or may not be able to recognize the talent, I think is a big local victory that I've seen, and that goes hand in hand with kind of universal screening policies. At the state level, I think one of my preferred favorites right now is mandating access to acceleration. This has happened in Ohio, was kind of one of the first places, has been replicated in Illinois. I know also Missouri is working on it as well, saying that all schools can decide how they do it, but they don't have a choice. They have to provide access to accelerated learning, and there's enforcement behind it. And then the very last one I'd say at the national level, because my first response was going to be that there isn't much, but at the national level, I will say the Higher Education Opportunity Act, which was actually signed by George W. Bush, so that's how old it is now, had many, many great things in it, including mandating teacher training. It was just never enforced. So this is probably something Julia has some experience with, is when doing policy, making sure there's actually teeth behind that policy. So I suppose those would be my 3 choices there.
Thanks, Scott. Marcia, what would you add to the conversation?
I could add better if I unmuted myself, right? I'm going to start at the national level, and we really have no national policy. And I think that is a major issue for the field. As everyone knows, local policies vary widely, as do state policies. Our Access Denied report showed that in states with policy, access, which we defined as attending a school where a student is actually identified as gifted, is better. However, we can't say that for equity. So states that have laws have better access, but just having access doesn't help with equity. And it's terrible for students in Title I schools and students who are Black, Latino, Native, ELL, or special needs. 30 states have laws regarding identification and services, but only 4 of those are fully funded. And those 4 states are Florida, Georgia, Iowa, and Oklahoma. 20 are partly funded. Another 7 states, 4 partially funded, have laws requiring identification only, which reminds me of an article that Joe Renzulli wrote years ago that said, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Copernicus, we regret to inform you, your child is gifted, but we have no services for them." And then 11 have language, but no laws, 4 with partial funding, and 2 have no laws or language at all. So I'm going to go back to those 4 states that have access. That have a mandate and fully funded. So they mandate identification services and they're fully funded. So the first state is Florida. 88% of its students attend schools that identify a kid. That means 12% have no access, even though there is a mandate, there is policy. The equity of access with regard to whether it's a title school or a non-title school is 51%. And what that means is that 6% of the students who attend title schools are identified versus 11% who attend non-title schools. The equity for Native, Black, Latinx, and Native Hawaiian it's all bad, but the worst is for Black kids at 0.43, meaning that 64 to 79% of Black students in Florida are missing. And this is a state that has good policy. They even have a Plan B where you can identify kids who come from other areas, So I think policy in this regard might be overrated. If I go to Iowa, our second state, 94% of the students in Iowa, they're second in the nation, have access. But again, 8% of students in title schools versus 12% in non-title schools are identified. And their representation indices for Native American, Black, Latino, and Native Hawaiian are all less than 0.5, Black being 0.35, meaning 68 to 75% of Black students in Iowa are missing from identification. Georgia, 96% of the students in Georgia attend a school that identifies. They're first in the nation. Yet in regard to title versus non-title, 7% of the students in title schools are identified versus 17% in non-title schools. And again, Black, Native American, Native Hawaiian, Latino kids at about 0.5, 70% of Black students are missing from gifted education identification in Georgia. And the last of those 4 states that have the best policy, because we always say if we have identification services and funding, we'll be good. Oklahoma, 92% of the students who attend schools in Oklahoma have access to being identified. They're 8th in the country. Yet if you attend a title school in Oklahoma, 14% of the students are identified versus 23% in non-title schools. Oklahoma is the only state in our entire sample where there's equity for Native children. Black children, however, are 0.56, Latino 0.64, and 63% of Latino students are missing from identification in Oklahoma. What I think is interesting is that the Bureau of Indian Education has language for funding. They fund twice 2.0 FTE for students, and it's part of the federal budget. and they have language that concerns ID and services. So I think in terms of federal, you look for the BIE situation and there is language, but that's a different kind of school. So I think policy is a good idea, but as enacted, I don't think it's working, even if we look at it as the trifecta of identification, programming, and services. When we drill down and we look for equity, we simply don't find it. So I hate to be doomsday, but that's sort of the state of things.
And Marcia, I hear that. And so policy is worthwhile when it's implemented. Jonathan, you're next.
Awesome, thank you. Let me start my timer here. A big thank you to Norma, Joy, and everyone else at Denver University, excuse me, who has helped with this symposium. I was scrolling through the participant list, and it was, it's great. We can't get together face to face, but it is really, really nice to see so many friends and all my Colorado friends. Except for Roger Dowd. If I knew he was here, I would not participate. Kidding, kind of, Roger, a little bit. Exemplar policies. I'm going to go national, state, local. National, my biggest concern is that No Child Left Behind and the Every Student Succeeds Act, they could have actually been great for gifted education and for talent development. And ESSA actually has parts in it that say all the right things, but none of it got translated into the actual regulations, which I will circle back to at the very, very end tonight. That is just such important work. You've already heard people talk about it. So that's just working advanced achievement and closing excellence gaps into state mandated accountability systems would make such a huge difference. We cannot get the feds or states to do it. That's a huge problem. At the state level, this is going to sound very in the weeds, but I think it's important, is that most state budget systems reward you for having students in seats. And even in more quote unquote enlightened school finance models, we call them generally money follows the student models. The problem is acceleration can screw up that model for you. So if you have students who are ready to move to high school early, move to college early, there is literally a financial penalty, a substantial financial penalty, if you're not really careful in how you design those systems. And so I mean, like literally how we fund schools disincentivizes advanced education. That's a problem at the state level. At the local level, it's not official policies that generally worry me, because those we can advocate for, those we can work with. It's implicit policies. It's the policies that people don't often verbalize, but you don't know that they're there until you see them. I almost said harming your child, but harming your child. And so the best example that I can give here quickly is that when one of our kids was in second grade, we had his teacher sit down and say, you know, he's a really good reader. We did not actually know this. We could not get him to read. And she said, he's actually way above grade level. And we were like, this is awesome. And my wife asked, so how can we help you work with him? And she said, what do you mean? And I thought, oh, this conversation's not going anywhere good. And she said, well, he's already above grade level and we have an anti-acceleration policy in this school. Therefore, I mean, he's fine. I'm just going to let him be on his own. And I'm sitting here thinking, did you just say my kid comes to school and is a free range kid? We decided to let it go. And by decided, I mean, I was told by my better half, stop worrying about this. Don't cause a scene. It happened in third grade. it happened in the 4th grade parent teacher conference. That's when I went to the principal, who we knew fairly well at that point, and said, I want to see this policy. I cannot believe in the 21st century we have an anti-acceleration policy. And she said, and I quote, "What are you talking about? We've never had a policy like that." And I said, "Well, you have an implicit policy like that because all your teachers think you do." And so she immediately went into their next faculty meeting and said, "Hold on, folks, we need to talk about differentiation, etc." So it's those implicit policies that can really trip you up, especially at the local level.
Thank you. Dina, what would you like to add?
So just to set the stage here, I'm in the presence of researchers. I am a practitioner, so I'm going to be talking through the eyes of somebody from the school district, from the school, and how we work with policy and see policy. I'm going to start with the local level, because the policy that governs us most at the local level is obviously going to be what's happening at the schools. So a school district approved governing board adopted gifted program policy and procedure manual, such as a scope and sequence, is critical for building sustainable services throughout a district. And the benefits really include laying the groundwork for building a sustainable model that holds schools accountable, because the procedures are defined by policy. So then moving to the state level, from a practitioner's perspective, it's going to be the gifted mandate, the state mandate, if you're lucky enough to have one. And I'd like to just point out a few opportunities and a few obstacles with the state mandates. First of all, an opportunity is when it provides flexibility and identification and services. In other words, a shall versus may, okay? Second is when the definition promotes equity and inclusion. Not a lot of policies do. And a third opportunity that I see is when the state also has a state-approved gifted test list that really is attuned to the needs of that state. And then some of the obstacles come in place when the state mandate is way too restrictive, like I think that some of my colleagues were just kind of mentioning. And also, like was mentioned, is when that policy is unfunded or periodically unfunded, like good years versus bad years. We're going to fund this year, we're going to partially fund next year. Well, if that's built into the policy, into the mandate, that's not going to be as much of an issue. One of the bigger issues, what I see in state mandates, especially in my state of Arizona, is that there's no enforcement in many of them. There's no watchdog. There's no data collection in many states, my own including. And when there's no monitoring and no accountability, there's no incentive to care for superintendents to really pay attention to this. And of course, when there's no state director for gifted, or when it's just a hat that somebody else wears, that's going to also impede the accountability and the monitoring of that. At a national level, like Jonathan was saying, at least with ESSA, it expanded to use Title I and Title II. Okay. Now, unlike NCOB, which was a deficit model, this is not quite such a deficit model, but the challenge becomes is that schools have already allocated those Title I and II funds, and they're very reluctant to give them up and to share, even to share they are. That's it.
I see lots of opportunity and I see lots of challenges that we have out there. Let's move on to the second prompt. Please share please share suggestions for improvements of local, state, and our national policies to support more equitable gifted education. This time, Jonathan, you'll go first.
Thanks, Julia. I'm pretty sure everyone is going to say a version of the phrase universal screening, so I'm just going to skip over that. I think everybody gets it. I want to talk about a couple other things and see how fast I can do it here. I've mentioned accountability systems. I think schools need to get credit in their state accountability system for closing excellence gaps, for closing participation gaps, for having better representation. The thing that I run into when I work in districts, which I do a lot, is I just run into especially central administrators who just don't care. They just do not think that this is important. They will tell you that they think it is not important in any way, shape, or form. They'll complain about representation on one hand, and then they'll turn around and say, oh, these kids will take care of themselves anyway. And I was like, well, if they could take care of themselves, we wouldn't have a representation problem, right? Like, even their basic, most obvious logic is so seriously flawed. And so I think that's something that we really have to do, is make them care about it. And it doesn't have to be a major factor, but it should be a factor. And I'm really big into, if a school district is really going to focus on closing these gaps and really creating great opportunities for every single student, they should be rewarded for that substantially. It should be a big deal. It's not a big deal in hardly any state right now. We need to make it a big deal. Senator Cory Booker, he has a bill that talks about universal enrollment. We don't have time to get into it because it's a fairly complex concept, but it basically says, instead of assuming that low-income students are starting below grade level, and maybe we'll give them opportunities to move up if they provide evidence, it says, let's put them all in advance and then see how that works out, and then work backwards from there. I know this drives a lot of gifted ed people up a tree, and I totally understand why, but it actually is a really compelling idea. Do I love the operationalization of it? I shouldn't try 6-syllable words this late at night, but I don't like how they're talking about it, but I like that they're throwing out an idea that really turns everything 180 degrees. You know, trying to come at these issues in a clever way. And then another thing that I wanted to talk about, I'm sure others will talk about, removing barriers at the state level to being able to use local norms. Lots of people are talking about it, but what they usually run into are state rules, regulations, laws that, if they don't ban it, they make it difficult. And I think making it much more flexible so that students can possibly be identified using local norms. Again, let's let states be creative, and let's let districts and educators be creative. Let's untie their hands here. I think that would help a lot. And in my last 75 seconds here, Scott Peters has heard me say this a billion times, but if you want to improve representation and close excellence gaps, you have to grow the pie. But what often happens is that we try to identify a more representative group of students, but we keep the amount of services the same. So the number of seats stays the same. That means that you are, by definition, picking winners and losers. So you're going to give needed services to some students, but then you have to take away needed services from others. Don't just slice up the same pie differently. Make more pie. You have to expand services. You have to expand seats. That's the only way to make this work long term.
Need a bigger pie. I like that. Marcia, you're next.
Well, piggybacking on Jonathan's pie, it goes to what we do in gifted education versus what we do in general education. And the question is, how can we make national and state or local policies support more equitable gifted education? Our work shows there really is no such thing as equitable gifted education. So the more equitable, we need it to be equitable, not more equitable, because it isn't equitable right now, and it hasn't been for years. I'm working on a chapter with a colleague, and they said historically underrepresented kids, and I'm like, no, they're not historically underrepresented. They're underrepresented now, and they have been historically underrepresented, and nothing has changed, which is really sad. So it goes to thinking about, what do we do in school? We find a few kids who are advanced and we do special things for them. And then we do other things for the other kids, which aren't so special. And then the gap widens. So I think evolution isn't working. What we need is revolution. And that involves turning what we do in schools upside down. And that involves creating schools that are places for talent development and places that look for what kids do well and what they are interested in and what their strengths are. And we're stuck in this, how do we test and identify? And we're working with tests that don't identify and haven't identified and never identified equitably, and yet we keep using them. And then we say, well, how can we use them better? Can we use local norms or local group norms? Yes, we can do that. But why are we so tied to the tests? And why aren't we looking at what talent is in various cultural groups? I'm going to read a definition of giftedness, and then I'll tell you where it came from. But this is the definition. Giftedness can be defined through Kawana Nawaya Ahwahi, the human way, meaning to live in balance and harmony with the world by having honor and respect for community members, the environment, self, ancestors, and creation. The human way is guided by language, culture, and is characterized by honor, humility, patience, gratitude, discipline, compassion, a good heart, and generosity, responsibility, and respect, maintaining relationships with the human and natural and spiritual realms, understanding and valuing the worldview, and making a contribution to the community. That's a definition that Lara Cooper found in 2014 when she studied the Hoopa, Yurok, and Karuk people who live in the Hoopa Valley Indian Reservation in Northern California. So I have to wonder, like, what would happen if we began to implement policies that said, rather than schools are places for remediation and test preparation, that schools are places where we prepare students for life in a informed democracy where science is real and news isn't fake, and we use critical and creative thinking to solve real problems to create a better human place. And we're not really doing that in our current thing. We're saying who qualifies for the special service, and we're promoting segregation and oppression. And as a result, our field is suffering because districts like New York and Seattle are eliminating programs because we don't have equity. And until we decide that equity is important, we're going to be at risk. I'll stop there. I don't know if I used my 5 minutes or not, but maybe I did.
I think that'll do. Thanks. Scott?
Yeah, a lot. It's hard to ever keep to your own answers when you're listening to all these other answers. Something I think I'll start with at the national level to piggy off something Marcia was just saying is, there's been so much talk for so long. And I think all educators would agree that we need to move away from, this idea of a deficit perspective and instead move towards a strengths-based perspective and embracing everything that all of our students bring to the table. And despite that fact, I feel like so much at the national level still remains about remediation, still focuses on getting kids to grade level. All of the funding essentially that comes from the national level on education is really all about kind of Title I, Title II. A lot of it is focused on providing additional funding to low-income schools, which is critically important. But I wish being equitable wasn't so much about just getting kids to grade level. Like, I wish there was more national policy and national culture around the idea that equity isn't just about minimal proficiency. And that's actually something I got from the first time I read Jonathan's work on excellence gaps years ago. I thought it would make all the difference in the world, and it has made a difference. But I thought all of a sudden people would start to see that equity doesn't mean just minimal proficiency. To really be equitable means we have to care about supporting all kids to be as good as they can be. But for some reason, we're just still stuck in this mindset that until we remediate you, you can't perform at advanced levels. Something I'd also say about national, and no, Jonathan, I'm not going to say local norms, but I am going to say Cory Booker's bill, which I believe was posted in the chat. And there's a lot of really good things in it. But one of the things I like the most is it just provides money for districts to do universal screening and does the kind of it provides the incentives and the funding, forget how much it is, for states to do it on a state level, they have to have some percentage of their schools actually on board in order to get the funding. But so that we don't have this kind of problem that we do in Arizona or Wisconsin, where there's a mandate, but only 50% of schools identify anybody, or New York, where it's about 9.5% of schools. So it actually does give some incentive for schools to do that. So that's the kind of policy that I would like to see. I've had some comments about in terms of enforcement and making sure there's plenty of sticks behind that policy. But I really want to talk about things more at a local level. And I think, April Wells, who I know is going to be speaking, I guess could be described as one of my gifted education on the ground heroes in this regard, because I think she does what is actually the long-term most effective strategy for reducing inequity in gifted education, which is providing targeted services in certain buildings, so not everywhere, but in certain buildings, so that GT resource teachers push in and not only look for students, so she has dedicated FTE for specific staff that go into some of her buildings with the highest poverty rates, the highest rates of students of color. They go in and do lessons with these kids and see who rises to the top. And the reason I think that that's so critical is instead of saying, oh, at this snapshot in time, we're going to look at the students and see who's already achieved at X level, because by definition, that's measuring opportunity. It's by definition, that's measuring access. It's always going to be. There's nothing we're going to do about that. We can measure kids in the first day of kindergarten, the massive gaps are already there. But instead, and other people do this as well, she goes into these buildings and does these lessons with these students and sees what shows up, because that way it's not relying on kind of their past experience to drive the achievement. And it also just has this powerful message that no, we're going to build these students up so that then they're ready, so that it's almost like gifted ed boot camp in a way. It's supporting these kids early. And I guess the other thing, and there's plenty of places to do this. I mean, Fairfax County has its Young Scholars model, which has also been very big in Minnesota. There are definitely models across the country where gifted ed programs are not just about serving the kids that are already high performing, but are actually trying to develop talents in kids who haven't had the opportunity yet. Because I think that's the biggest, kind of philosophical, ethical, moral barrier facing the field is, kind of by definition, we are a field that challenges advanced learners, but we exist in one of the most unequal societies, on the planet, certainly in Western civilization. Our lowest income students actually do relatively well compared to other countries' lowest income students, but we have so many of them. We have an embarrassingly, humiliatingly high level of child poverty that it brings I feel stupid even saying this, it brings our score down if that's the biggest thing to care about, which of course it isn't. But we have this massive undertaking where we have this huge, just unconscionable level of inequality, and we're trying to solve it with just these tiny little interventions. I think it's really going to take the kind of things like what April does, like what Fairfax does, to truly try to close those opportunity gaps and to kind of repay that education debt, I think is a good way to frame it.
Important ideas. Dina, from a district perspective, what would you add?
To share suggestions for improvement, well, I could basically touch upon everything everybody else said, but specifically Scott, because he just said it, I'll add to that. In April and I have had a lot of these discussions as well. Creating different criteria for different schools is not a terrible thing. Especially if you're using building norms or local norms, that what we do, what I think a good practice is to universally screen test everybody, or at least screen everybody, and then flex students into services. Now I call that as my terminology that I use in my district, but provisional placements, flexing kids in whatever the percentage of that building, and what, like Scott was saying, use it. It's not just a talent pool. They are getting, in my district anyway, they're getting the exact same services are offered to them, but we're using a lot of diagnostic testing and formative assessments in order to see where those kids are and what they need. And chances are they end up identifying officially later on after we flex them in. So we do have different building criteria. Of course, the state has their own mandated criteria. But the other thing is, when you're looking at a local level, suggestions for improvement, some of the very simple practical things are things like using the school district's mission statement when advocating, embedding gifted services into the district's strategic plan or long range plan, whatever it is. All districts have to have one. You need to be at the table with that voice and being part of that discussion in order to affect change in your district. Of course, we need to, at the local level, we need to advocate for Title I and Title II funds, because the law says that we are eligible to access those. But the Twatty, this is the way we've always done it. They don't want to give that up. And then once again, creating a district approved testing procedural practices that are actually reflective of that district. So at the state level, I'm going to keep going back to these. I mentioned the state gifted mandate, but what can we do better? We need to put teeth into it. We need to, what about withholding other grant funding if anyone is not, if the gifted grant is not funded appropriately, if there's no accountability? We would never do that, but that's one way, that's one approach. And of course, the state level is, I think Scott mentioned, is mandate that the schools use or allow the use of local and building norms. At the state approved gifted test level, we need to put into the state mandate that the test list be updated, be revised, be looked at. A lot of these we continue with our antiquated practices because we've got antiquated policies in place. We need to look at those. We need to update those. And then exemplary state policies, when you think about what those look like, you need to include specifics like how is it funded, who gets identified, and how. What's the definition of gifted services for your state, and how broad can we make those, or how flexible are those? Because inflexibility is what's keeping kids out. What services are required, and what is the timeline for implementation and monitoring, and who does that? That is way overlooked in too many states. At the national level, obviously, like I've said, decrease the obstacles that districts have when they have access to some of those funds.
Wow, so much work to be done, but isn't it important for us to be talking about it here? Next prompt. Address policy concerns with strategies and recommendations for gifted education researchers, practitioners, and families. This time, Marcia, you're first.
It's a big question. It's a big
Huge.
prompt. So what we need, Julia, I think, is a fundamental change in policies. From our work with the Access Denied report, we know that policies create access. If a state has a policy, more kids are attending schools where there are programs, but the representation of underserved populations, Black and brown kids, kids who attend schools where most of the families are low income, is abysmal. And so what we have in place is this idea that if we just have these policies, that it will fix itself. But what we're dealing with, we thought we were post-racist. Some of us did. I don't know. I was talking with some friends after the insurrection, and I wasn't surprised, but I will say I was horrified. And some of my Black and brown friends said to me, yeah, we've been living in this America for decades. And I was like, you have? And I've always thought of myself as woke, but really that is where we are. And gifted education, unfortunately, is a reflection of that. It's been used as a tool of segregation, and it's been okay. We've wrung our hands and said, oh, we have underrepresentation, but we still use the same tests that we've been using for 100 years. And those tests, when they were developed, yielded disparate results. And then we say, well, you know, they yield disparate results at the end. And what are we going to do? Well, we'll use local norms, or we'll use local group norms. We need to get beyond using tests that were developed on the majority culture and applying them to cultures where there weren't students in the development of those tests. So we're taking measures and we're pretty sure that those measures measure intelligence. Well, not really. And as long as we continue to do that, and I hear people in goodwill saying we need to update the tests we use, we need to update the procedures we use to allow kids to move into a talent development thing. And more importantly, we need to update what we do in schools so that instead of focusing on raising test scores and remediation and what kids can't do, we need to focus on what they can do. We need fundamental changes in policies. 82% of the teachers are white. All teachers need anti-racist training. You're either racist or you're anti-racist. You're not somewhere in the middle. They all need to read Kendi's book. They need to know, all teachers need to know about talent development, and talent development programs need to be inclusive and woven into the fabric of our schools. Researchers need to study all students. We can't continue to eliminate Native Americans because there aren't enough of them. The reason there aren't enough of them is because there was genocide. So we need to include all students. Test developers need to pay attention to how the test works with all students. We have an article coming out in Roper Review where we looked at the top 10 tests, individual and group IQ tests that are used to identify students. And it's frightening to know that these tests were not developed to be used the way that we use them. And practitioners should not choose measures that yield disparate results. And another thing is we shouldn't use our entire gifted budget trying to paying for tests to figure out who is and who isn't gifted. So I think there's a lot of things that we need to do, but I think at the bottom end of it, we need to say, what is it we've been doing that isn't working? Because for all of the time I've been in gifted education, and all of the time my mentors have been in gifted education, and all of the time people who came before them have been into gifted education, generations and generations, we've had an equity issue. We've had an issue of who we don't identify. And I'm going to say it again, we need revolution because evolution is simply not working.
Lots to think about. Jonathan, you're next.
All right, let me start my timer here, Julia, so you don't have to tell me to stop. All right, strategies for policy change to get these policies changed. The number one most important strategy is to have a strategy. I don't care what your strategy is, you don't create policy change at any level, defined very broadly, without having a plan. I've seen so many advocacy efforts go off the rails. You know, people have just put blood, sweat, and tears for weeks, months, years. And then at the last minute, they say, okay, let's start a letter writing campaign before the hearing tomorrow. Write everyone you know who's a state representative. That is, you're just shooting in 1,000 directions at once. It's, okay, which committee is going to hear the bill? Who do we know on that committee? Who are our best sources of insight on that committee? Do we have friends we've done favors for on that committee on completely different issues? Maybe they'll take a phone call from us to say, this is a really important bill for kids, etc. So just have a plan. Just be thoughtful about it when you're working with policymakers. It makes a huge difference. Creating sort of the biggest tent you can to bring your colleagues together. Maybe that means that sometimes you make calls to a state senator or a US senator or whoever, your governor's office, to help a local special ed parents group, knowing that one day you're going to need them to make calls for you. So just learning who you can work with is really, really important. And then just getting to know your representatives. They are there to literally represent you. It's in their title, right? Get to know them, just to get to know them as people. You don't have to agree with them on anything but the issues that you care about. Just get to know them. You don't have to be enemies. And the first thing that I always say whenever I meet someone is, how can I help you? What's your issue? What do you need? Do you need research on ESL interventions? I will go out and find someone for you. Just tell me what you need. Get them to start seeing you as their ally, not just someone asking for give me, give me, give me. We all want to help out our allies and friends. And so I think that's really important. One thing that drives me crazy, and I've run into this, I've done policy work on the ground in literally almost all 50 states. The thing that drives me crazy is when I'm talking to someone and I think I've got them to buy into it. And then they say, and it happens almost every time, well, my neighbor says, like, nothing good is gonna finish that sentence for me, right? It's gonna be, well, my neighbor said these kids can learn on their own, or something like that. I always leave those conversations thinking, why do they not have smarter neighbors? I mean, why? That happens every time. Here's the catch though, be their smarter neighbor. Be the person who they're friendly with, who says hi to them in the supermarket, and just asks how their day is. Be a genuine human to them. You'll be shocked at how open-minded they are. Policymakers want good ideas, and they know that most of what's given to them is highly partisan. They want good bipartisan ideas that work, especially at that state level, or even more local, your city or town. So again, be the neighbor, because if you're not, there's someone else who's going to be, and they probably don't care about your topic in any way, shape, or form. Be the friendly neighbor. And then I promised that I would loop back to this at the very end. If a bill becomes a law, it is not over. It is not over by any stretch. So again, every Student Succeeds Act, it has wonderful language about advanced achievement, closing excellence gaps. But my concern was, oh man, if the regulatory committee doesn't write good regulations, everyone's going to ignore it. Dr. Peters talked about the Higher Education Opportunity Act. Why was that ignored? Because the regulations are so soft that no one has to follow the law, at least in this one particular area. So I have 7 seconds left, so I'm going to wrap this up quickly with don't let up. Even after it's signed, that's when you go to the governor, state superintendent, and say, I have people that I want to nominate to help write those regulations. That's the part of the law that gets implemented, not the law itself. It's not focused, it's not over until you're implementing it. Thank you, Julia.
That's very practical and right on target. Scott?
Yeah, you know, how provocative to be in only 5 minutes. You know, I think a consideration for people involved in gifted education policy, you know, something I want to throw out is to consider whether or not giftedness as a policy is working for us. And by that, I mean, you know, gifted education or giftedness exists as this social construct in schools, you know, just like, you know, we have all these other constructs, students, you know, limited English proficiency, English language learners, and those categories exist based on this premise that by labeling students as such, they're going to be provided with some kind of service that's going to make their lives better, that's going to support them as individuals, you know, that's going to enfranchise them and value them. And, you know, there's downsides to labeling in anything, and I think we all know that. But hopefully we would all say, well, being labeled as a student with a learning disability, the downsides are worth it because all these great things that come. And I think people interested in gifted education policy should say, what are we actually trying to accomplish? What is the goal? You know, kind of getting at Jonathan's point, the plan, you know, what's our strategy here? What do we want to have happen? And is more giftedness, more identification of students as gifted, the venue through which that can happen? Because if you want more, for example, I'm just going to make something up. You want more students of color taking AP classes in high school. There are a lot of ways to get there that don't involve gifted education. You know, you don't have to have call anybody gifted to get there. So I'm not advocating we burn down the building, but what I'm saying is people that are thinking about policy is think about the goal as what you want to have happen, not the goal is giftedness or more people labeled as gifted or whatever it is. Think of the goal as, again, whatever it is, something concrete, more students taking AP classes if you want that, more students being grade accelerated. I don't know what it is, but think of that as the goal. The other thing I'd say about identification policy, because identification is my specific area of nerdiness, is there is absolutely no identification system that will ever result in equity in terms of proportionality. None. Well, I shouldn't say that. There's one, random assignment. So if we were to identify students for gifted services in a lottery, we would have, and perfectly implement it, we'd have perfect proportionality. Now, lotteries don't work because not everyone signs up, but that is the only way you'd actually have a perfectly representative population in your service population. And the reason is because we have such an unequal society that by the time we go to do any identification or any assessment with any test we could ever conceive, we've treated students so differently based on their socioeconomic status, based on the house that their parents can afford in the school district they want to live in. You know, here in Madison, where I live, a year of childcare is way more. It's almost 50% more than a year of college. And so this idea that we could design an identification system that somehow is going to take people that we've treated so differently and all of a sudden narrow those massive opportunity gaps is just unlikely to ever happen. If we really want to make a dent in equity for gifted education from a policy standpoint, we have to mitigate those massive disparities that we provide kids with. We have to start treating kids, I'm going to say equally, but what I mean is equitably. We have to start providing people more equal learning opportunities that aren't premised on something like whether or not they can live in a good neighborhood, whether or not they speak English as a native language, you know, what the color of their skin is. And I think that's probably our biggest barrier, is that we've been chasing the right identification system for so long when we've been kind of ignoring the big driver, which is this hugely disparate opportunities that we provide kids. And that's kind of a depressing side note, but I do think it is important work, and it has a lot of other positive effects on kids as well.
And that takes us this round back to you, Dina.
Okay, so before I talk a little bit about what I was thinking about in advance, I wanted just to respond to one thing that both Marcia and Scott said about being tied to the test. As a district coordinator, director, whatever, we have to find a way to make it manageable. And so the testing is one element, but it's not the test. It's what we do with the test results. It's what we do after we have that information and how we group the students and how we accelerate. Grouping and acceleration are no brainers because it doesn't cost anything, right? And it really a lot of times is outside of policy too, unless you have a policy specifically prohibiting that. But it's what we do with the results. And as you said, Julie, to begin with, you said that policy is something you need to work hard at to put into place. So as a district court perspective, what I want to just emphasize is that policy that's bereft of funding is hollow. Schools are not going to reallocate existing funds if state grant funds are removed or halted for a year, like an unfunded mandate, like Marcia was talking about at the beginning. That's why it's so important to build the gifted services into the existing structures. And I think that's what a lot of my colleagues here are saying as well, because then they become impossible to, or a lot harder to eliminate. So a couple practical approaches that I advocate for us in my book with Scott on gifted programming, we've talked about this. And it's to embed gifted service, what we know is good for gifted kids, into the infrastructure of the school system, into the existing school structures. And we can do that without a lot of policy or funding in a lot of cases, by grouping, by placing how we place students, by not even grade level acceleration, but even subject acceleration. We can manage that in our school. We need to be part of curriculum adoptions. So we're not just going to the lowest level of the bar as possible. One of the big things is, and that I think we've also alluded to, is the professional learning opportunities. So what I do, I really emphasize in my department, my gifted ed department. So I'm at the table with all the other departments, and we interact on a continual basis on every committee, every meeting, every what. So like I work very closely with the special ed department, because how they're identifying kids, some of our kids are going to slip through them if those school sites and special ed teachers aren't aware. So I meet every year with those folks. The same thing with language acquisitions. I work with the ELL teachers, but I also have trainings just for the language acquisition testers. Those folks that go from school to school trying to see watch how the kids progress through the language acquisition, giving them some tools and some understandings. They see the spark in that child's eye when they're doing that testing. They will bring nominations. The same thing with the fine arts group, the fine arts teachers, band, music, art, whatever. I work with them at the same thing, because they're going to notice strengths and different ways of thinking that, and create, especially with critical thinking, creativity, that some of the classrooms or teachers are not going to see, just because the structure of the classroom and because of their lack of maybe background in that. Which brings us to also with our professional development. We have after school and during school workshops for gifted every single, like 3 days a week in my district year round, but they're offered to, of course, gifted teachers are required, but everything else is offered to all teachers in the district. K-12, special ed, fine arts, everything, for those same reasons. We want to interact with our assessment department, because we need them to be able to collect data on the students that are achieving out of level, and to monitor the progress of those students so that we can better align our professional learning and curriculum and everything else that we do for those kids. Working with the grants department as well. There's a lot that we can do to interact with our systems that we have, and not rely on a policy that's going to come and save and be the saving grace in order for us to have gifted education and strong, sustainable services in our districts. A lot of boots on the ground.
Lots of boots on the ground. You're absolutely right. And it's making the connections between all of those different components within a school system that could impact gifted kids. Yeah, you're right. Okay, we're at the point we can have some questions from our wonderful participants. And I'm thinking there's someone that is looking at those questions. Is that correct?
Yes, indeed, Julia. Yes, indeed.
Just checking.
So I'm so inspired by everyone's remarks, and also by the fabulous questions that are being asked. This comes from our friend and colleague, Dr. Ellen Honeck. How can we leverage other aspects of education and teachers to increase our programming? Equitable programming is an issue across all education. How can we leverage relationships to create a revolution in education?
I think anyone could speak up on that.
Well, I use the word revolution, and I think leveraging relationships is a great idea, but I think it begins at the onset of why do we educate? What is our goal here? What do we want to produce after 13 years of kids in school? And I think right now we're stuck in an accountability circle, which is, we want to show that we're doing well on our tests. And as a result, any child who comes to school not on par is remediated, and remediation doesn't work, but we continue to do it. It's kind of like DARE, the drug education doesn't work, but it sounds good, so we do it. And what we need to do is begin to think, deeply about what is it we do. And if we look at all kids in terms of what their strengths, interests, and talents are, and we teach every student as if it is a gifted ed program. And I'm not saying we don't accelerate and we don't enrich the kids for whom that isn't enough, but imagine the levels of talent we might be able to have if we weren't caught in a remedial what's wrong instead of what's right system. So that's why I use the word revolution, because it's not a matter of tweaking it here or there. It's a matter of turning it on its head and saying in order to have equity, we have to begin to say, what are these kids capable of? What are they interested in? What can they do, rather than how can we fill them as empty vessels?
Any other response?
I guess there's something I would say, Julia, is that an angle that I've tried to get more attention to advanced learners in every school is to try to talk about the variability. You know, we talk a lot about diversity in students, but we don't often talk about like the different strengths that students bring to the classroom and what that means that we should be teaching them. And so I try to talk to my undergrads about this idea that, you know, you can't effectively teach a classroom of kids unless you know who they are. You know, you have to get information about their experiences, you know, what they like to do so you can make connections in your lessons, what they already know about fractions and all this kind of stuff. And one of the things I've started talking with teachers a lot more about is looking at any data that they have. Doesn't have to be from a standardized test. It can be from a classroom level, you know, very formative assessment, and seeing the diversity and readiness. Because one of the things we found in some work that I've done is, you know, the average classroom has about 7 grade levels of readiness in it. And that's the kind of the median. So you've got schools that are classrooms that are even more diverse and classrooms that are less in terms of readiness. And teachers get that. I mean, they know about these kids. They want to do more to challenge these kids. They're the ones that keep them up at night. They feel like they're always running out of time and they never get to these kids. And that's where, you know, I was never a kind of a cluster grouping researcher, but, you know, I've done plenty of work with Marcia and with Dina who are. And that's where you can talk to them about this idea of, okay, how do we make structures so that you can better target your efforts on your kids, so that you're not trying to teach 7 lessons at a time. Instead, you're able to target your all of your efforts, all of your expertise on a particular group of students. So it's kind of trying to showing them how this can help them or can make their lives better, I think is a big part of advocacy, whether it's with an individual classroom teacher or a school, showing them how doing kind of what you want them to do or what you're advocating for is actually not in conflict with what they're trying to do. And it seems to be something that they can grab a hold of, like, yeah, that's really unreasonable. What should we do about that? And then you can kind of get them a little bit more on your side. So it's something that all teachers are trying to do.
Good point. Norma, another question?
Yes, indeed. This one comes from Vicky Boley. She says, such foundational observations you've brought up in connection to operational and conceptual definitions of giftedness, I can't help but wonder how many currently held educator perceptions are rooted in colonized white definitions of giftedness, and how many programming practices thus simply lend toward perpetuating inequities in respect to underrepresented populations. I wonder how indigenous and/or culturally and/or linguistically different populations conceptualize giftedness, and how might those conceptualizations be crucial, important indicators of what needs to change so as to move toward more equitable gifted programming and services.
Wow.
Okay, I've been too negative, so I'm going to jump in right away because I've got a really positive answer to this, which is, yes, I know I need this. So I went to graduate school at Purdue University, and I had the privilege, among many people, of having Gene Peterson as a professor. And to this day, I will go to my grave saying this, one of my all-time favorite articles, and people are welcome, I'll give it to you if you want, but it's behind a paywall. I'll put the link in the chat. Is an article by Gene Peterson where she basically, this must have been quite a number of years ago, but she roamed around the country to, I think, 10 different communities. It included a Native American reservation, the only one in Iowa. It included inner city Milwaukee, and she sat down with communities and just said to them, tell me what gifted means in your community. And it kind of gets back to the definition that Marcia was talking about earlier. But I used to always make my students read it to get at this idea of that culture permeates everything that we do, and whose culture is the dominating culture, and to just get them to think about the fact that, oh, even giftedness is through a specific cultural lens, and not everybody views it the same way, and the implications that has. So if you're interested in this topic, it's an article in Journal for the Education for the Gifted, and I just love it. So any chance I have to share it, I yell from the rooftops.
What a great resource to share.
Yeah, and it's a great piece because we develop the instruments based on a colonized white view. We use them on all kids and we select kids, and we know that what we get is disparate, yet we continue to do it. And then we say, well, let's use a local norm and let's continue to use the same instrument. And I'm not opposed to testing. What I'm opposed to is testing being the center of the universe. So if a student gets a high test score on whatever your identification instrument is, that wasn't by accident. So use those high test scores as a means for inclusion, but recognize that we're missing kids. So rather than saying, unless you score X, you can't get in, rather than using those high test scores as means of exclusion, use them for inclusion, and then say, what are other pathways in? And then more importantly is into what? What is our program? Is our program an advanced reading program? Are we going to continue to define giftedness based on school-based attributes, or might we look at something more like that definition I read earlier? And I really think that the field could benefit from looking at conceptualizations of giftedness that reach beyond a colonial white view of, we do well in school and answer questions rapidly and score high on IQ tests, therefore, we're what matters. It's really, right now it's dysfunctional and it's disparate and it's not equitable.
Thanks. Anyone else want to share thoughts? On to the next question, Norma.
This one comes from our colleague Pam Klinkenbeard. Setting aside for a moment the critical questions of what policies should look like, what else do panelists suggest for how to affect policy language? Pam says she agrees with Jonathan on pursuing legislative action, that it's an ongoing process, but what about, for instance, targeting the companies and associations that write boilerplate policy for school boards?
I'll tackle this one briefly. Pam knows I could talk about this for about 6 hours, and no one wants to listen to that, so I'm going to keep this quick. Look at what the major bills are in most states every legislative cycle. They are shockingly the same. In some cases, the only thing that's different is the state or commonwealth's name. That's not an accident. Those legislators are getting these sample policies from the same partisan groups. ALEC, especially in more right-leaning states, when you sometimes wonder, where did this crazy idea about evaluating teachers with test scores come from? And why did 10 states come up with the same idea at the exact same time? Well, the answer is they didn't. A conservative group did and said, this is a great way to squeeze unions, so we're going to do this. And the bills were almost exactly the same in every single state. It's good to know about that. It's really hard to fight against it at the same time. Just this week alone, I've had 2 different conversations with people saying, it would be so helpful to states if groups like NAGC could help us write similar boilerplate language for policies that we think would move the needle on these issues. I think they're right. At times, NAGC has started to do it. It's just a lot of work. It's a lot of work to fine tune these policies. And I think it's something that we have to do. Like, what does a model acceleration policy look like? Well, Bell and Blank has helped us with that, right? Let's put it into really good legislative language and make sure advocates in all 50 states and DC have that. I think we need to do more things like that. The problem is we don't have full-time lobbyists in every single state, and these other groups do. And so I'm making it sound like it's a Mr. Smith goes to Washington, we have to fight the machine, but we do. The nice thing is we have states like New Jersey, Illinois, that have really had huge policy victories recently, like doing what Marcia is calling for, just really passing laws that almost start from scratch and rebuild the entire system. That's hard to get past, but we have examples in big states where we've been able to do it. So I think there are lots of success stories out there, and people in those states love to talk to people in other states about here's how we did it. So definitely reach out to folks like that. And if NAGC or CEC TAG or any of our great centers can help connect you with those people, please just ask any of us.
I'll jump in here and talk about it from a practical aspect as far as affecting policy change from school district perspective. Well, actually, not just school district. So superintendents conferences, Scott and I actually presented it, both presented at one this week. I'm presenting at AASA in a couple of weeks. I think we're missing opportunities to reach outside of our group, out of our field. We're always preaching to the choir. Who are the policymakers when you're talking about school districts? It's governing boards, it's superintendents that are leading this charge. We need to do better at getting to them. So I'm like actually starting to speak and starting to try to connect with people more outside of our field. And there's a lot of, because who are the people that rise to some of these positions as school board members, as superintendents? A lot of them are parents of gifted students. But as leaders, most of them have not had any background or experience with formal gift education outside of personal experiences. So if we kind of, tear at the heartstrings a little bit with some of these folks that are local, I think that we can make a much bigger impact than we've had by continuing to preach to the choir. But the school board associations, the superintendents, those associations, I think that we need to do a better job at targeting some of those folks and informing them better.
Undoubtedly, we need to be talking with others who make decisions. And just as we need relationships with legislators, we need them with people who are leading districts in our states and organizations. You're right. Absolutely. Any other comments on this query? Norma, back to you.
We have a really concrete question from Deb Nielsen asking about the specific assessment instruments that do not yield disparate results.
Volunteers?
It's a good question. We looked at 10 instruments, the 5 most commonly recommended group measures and the 5 most commonly recommended individual measures across all ability measures. This article is coming out to a Roper review near you soon. And what we found was that all of the instruments that we looked at yielded disparate results at the onset. Some of them said that they had and it's really interesting because we had to buy the manuals in order to see the normative samples. So these are not data that are readily available in many cases. So a test developer develops an instrument and says they have a representative sample, but they don't do invariance testing, or they don't report group norms, or they may do invariance testing, but they don't report the results. And they say, here's an instrument that measures IQ, which we immediately equate to intelligence. And intelligence quotient isn't really intelligence. It's a measure of intelligence, and it has limitations. But because it's been so ingrained in society for 100 years, everybody's like, ooh. I mean, I saw a news thing, a month or so ago that said something about, if you eat certain things, it lowers the IQ of your infant. which makes no sense because you can't measure an IQ of an infant. So how can we know if we've lowered the IQ of an infant? But the news reporters are saying, don't do this or you'll have a lower IQ child, which tells you how much in popular society we equate the IQ score with intelligence. My point is that of those 10 instruments, only one of them included Native Americans in the sample at all, and they didn't report group means or group anything with regard to that group. And so we are sold an instrument, and I worry about schools spending, including on things, even our work, the Hope Scale or any instrument, spending all this money to try to figure out who is and who is not gifted. Schools are not an end product. Schools are supposed to develop children. So to say you are or you aren't gifted when you're 8, to me doesn't make a lot of sense. And yet schools will spend their whole budget doing that. So if you're going to use an instrument for measurement to identify precocity, for example, you should look at who was in the normative sample. Who was it developed on before you apply it to your population at the very least? And we don't do that. We just assume that because it comes printed out and it looks pretty and it has face validity, that it's meaningful. And I'm not saying it's not meaningful. They've been developed. Students who get really high scores, great, serve them, but don't assume because a student doesn't have a high score that somehow they're not capable, or that you write them off, or that you say that, you know, they didn't qualify because. I mean, when you look back at the poverty reports from Jack Kent Cooke Foundation, one of the things that stuck with me is if you have an achievement score, which is tightly correlated with an IQ score, and that achievement score, if you're from a high SES family and your achievement score is in the 90th or above percentile, that's equivalent to a student who's at the 70th percentile from a low SES family. And yet when we do screening, we'll say, well, we'll further screen anybody who's above the 90th on any given measure. Well, we leave out all the low income kids. My take is anybody above the 50th is potentially gifted, and maybe even below that, depending on the day they took the test. So I think we put way too much emphasis on tests because somehow we believe they're objective. And yet they were developed by people and they have error. And so, yeah, okay, we can use the test, but what are the other pathways? What are we looking at individually? Why is a teacher judgment so less qualified than a test score? It should be both, not, you know, and it's or, not and. So that I think there aren't many tests that aren't disparate at the beginning.
I'd like to jump on that also, and I agree with all of that. But another thing that I see that schools just do a terrible job is when they try to look at multiple measures, they combine them. Those tests were never created to be combined. So you're going to put up more barriers when you say, yeah, you've got this, but you also need this achievement and level and that. What I take the opposite approach. I like to look at kids with potential, even if they're not gifted, treat them as if they were, and then work with them in the same ways, and then continue to see where they go with it. But by putting all these obstacles in the way, by saying you need this, this, and this, and then wonder why we have disproportionality in gifted, doesn't make sense.
Yeah, the pathways should be or, right? You have this or this, not and.
Just quickly, the assumption in the question, it's a good question. The assumption in the question is that it's possible to have measures that don't have disparate results for different groups. I would question that assumption. I mean, you can't make that assumption unless you assume every group that you're concerned about has had the same opportunities. And there are certain populations within this country who have legally been denied opportunities for 200 or more years. How on earth can you create a test that could possibly equate that for you? I think that's very unfair to kids. And I mean, we hear claims all the time about new instruments, tests, measures. This, if you use this, all your disproportionality problems are going to go away in special ed, advanced ed, blah, 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 blah. Shockingly enough, the results, when you really look at them, tend to look like what most other existing measures give us. And that's because you haven't solved the underlying problem, which is discrimination, racism, classism, sexism, misogyny, that creates these very disparate opportunities that we know kids come into preschool not having had the same opportunities, and those differences are already huge. So I know we focus so much on identification. I do it a lot in my work. But it's really about how can we get more equity in opportunity from the moment these children are born, and even with prenatal care before that, to help create more opportunity for kids who are just systematically denied those opportunities. That's the challenge, I think, of this century for us, is how do we create that equality of opportunity and then make sure everyone's benefiting equally from those opportunities. The assessment stuff, it's dramatic to say it's a bit of a sideshow, but it's a bit of a sideshow in many ways. It's the symptom, it's not the disease.
And I'll extend that one piece further. I don't disagree at all with you, Jonathan. I think there are the people at this conference notwithstanding, but I think half of the country is very comfortable with a white supremacist view of identification and segregation and giftedness. So we're sitting here saying, how do we solve it? When in fact, there are many people in many districts across the country. And when we did the Access Denied report, I thought maybe we would find certain regions where, you know, the proportionality was worse. And we didn't. We found across the country, and in fact, in states where they have the largest populations, with the exception of Hispanics in Florida and Texas and Native Americans in Oklahoma, the largest proportions of underserved kids, whatever that group is, in the states where there are the most of those kids attending, they're least represented. And I think that is a symptom of systemic racism and comfortableness with the status quo. We don't want our kids to go to school with those kids. We don't want our kids to go to school with the poor kids or the brown kids or the whatever kids. So we fight on the parent advisory boards and all of this to keep it the way it is. And that creates segregation. And we've tiptoed around this in our field for years, but nothing has changed. And I think there's a point where we need to call it out. And while some of us are working toward that, there are other people working actively against it. And that hurts. I think that's really sad.
I want to offer, mostly just because now I'm liking the conversation, and so now I feel like I want to be involved in it. I want to offer a way of thinking about identification differently for us all. And when I wrote a book with some colleagues called Beyond Gifted Education, and one of the things we wrote in there that I didn't really think much of at the time, but I think I'm starting to realize might have been, I guess, more correct, is thinking about identification from a proactive perspective. And so thinking about it from this standpoint, you've got some service. You've got 7th grade algebra, you've got 8th grade geometry, you've got a compacted math program, whatever it is, you've got a service. You know, too often identification, and I think many of the other speakers have brought this up, is about setting up barriers to prevent, you know, the wrong people or people who aren't ready from getting into that service, because it's going to water it down because we don't want them there, whatever. It's set up as a barrier to keep them out. And, you know, maybe in the most extreme kinds of services, you know, drastic grade acceleration, you know, graduating a kid at 14 or something, we need to be really, really careful we don't accidentally serve the kid, maybe. But for most of our services, that's just not the case. So I like to talk about identification from the standpoint of kind of like, where is the bigger risk of harm? If we accidentally keep a kid out, even though she would benefit, or we accidentally let a kid in, even though it's not really for her. So like, think about typical gifted ed services, you know, enrichment programs, you know, greater depth and complexity type programs, cluster grouping. Oh my gosh, we just accidentally let a kid go in the advanced cluster. You know, I know Marcia and Dina talk about this all the time. Oh, you know, it's horrible. We have to make sure we set really high criteria so the kid doesn't accidentally get in the highest cluster. Why do we do this to ourselves? Like, why do we want to field those phone calls? Instead, why don't we have a program that essentially starts from the position of open enrollment? And that's what we talked about in Beyond Gifted Ed. You take the service and you say, anybody that wants to sign up is welcome to do so. However, just doing that is not going to result in equity, because not everybody knows about it. not everybody's going to feel culturally included or that it's a place for them that values them. This is something that people that look like me don't have to think about very often, but lots of people aren't going to feel included. We have to proactively search out kids who might benefit. So in addition to allowing it to be open, creating an identification system that searches out every other kid who might benefit, but who didn't sign up because their parents, drove them there at 8 a.m. when the sign up opened. So thinking about identification from a proactive standpoint of searching out talent that hasn't already shown up, I think makes our lives a little bit easier, in truth, maybe a little bit better, and also is probably going to be more equitable.
Hey, Scott's comment and I totally agree with everything that Dr. Peters just said wholeheartedly. It reminds me of the old joke. Why does everyone think that everyone in gifted ed are a bunch of elitists? And the answer is because we're a bunch of elitists. It's so hard you have to sort of check yourself and step back sometimes and say, am I doing everything I can to let as many kids get these services as humanly possible? If you can't say I absolutely am, then the finger's pointing back at you. And I think that's really, really important. In one program we have in New York City, after a while, we were like, why are we identifying kids? Why don't we just let them self-identify? Let them know what the program is, give them a few weeks in it. And then if they want to stay, they can stay. If they don't, they don't. And you know what? Almost all the kids stay and they do great. I think there are clever ways we can think about who's getting the services and how we connect the child to the service. I think we've seen more creativity in this regard in the last 5 years than we probably have in the previous 25 or so, which I think is really, really exciting. But we're going to have to think outside of the box some more.
Norma, I bet we're ready for the next question.
Thank you. There are so many wonderful questions. It's hard to choose among the tremendous list. This one's actually directed to Jonathan, but I think we'll open it up to everybody. The anonymous attendee says, I believe all students deserve to have their talents and creativity developed. What aspects of gifted education do you believe are fundamental for the special education of the psychologically gifted and twice exceptional? And someone else has been asking about autism and gifted. What aspects of gifted education are crucial to maintain, and what aspects should be available to all students?
That is a rather complex question. Holy smokes. You couldn't have listed Marcia's name first when you asked that question. You had to list mine.
Sorry.
Well, I have to admit, philosophically, that's hard for me to answer because after reading Dr. Peters' book with his colleagues, it did really start to change the way that I see these things. Scott, you've often asked the question, I should just let you answer this, but Scott's often asked the question, it's not about how do you find the kids who need the services, it's figuring out what the services are that each kid needs. And I'm routinely on panels where I'll be the only gifted ed person. That's never a fun panel to do. And people just take shots at you constantly saying, I don't want gifted ed. I want a perfectly individualized and customized school system where every child's needs are met. And they give this fantastic speech. And then they turn to me and I say, I want the exact same thing. Passionately. I could not agree with you more. The difference is I know we are not close to being able to do that. So in the meantime, I'm going to try to patch it together the best I can. Would I love a world where we don't need gifted ed, special ed, blah, blah, blah? Absolutely, 100%. Because, I mean, those of you who are parents, you don't look at your kid and say, oh, special ed kid on Tuesdays, gifted ed kid on Wednesdays. You see a child who has specific needs, dreams, etc. Whatever they need is what we need to get them. So what's like where that magic line is where we cross over into gifted ed, I'm just not that concerned about that. I know that we've got tons of bored kids in our classrooms, and some of the work that Scott and I have done with our colleagues, every classroom in this country has bored, under-challenged kids. Every single classroom, every single one. Most of them have lots of those kids. What can we do for those kids while also helping the kids, because every classroom has them, the kids who are struggling with some stuff? Maybe it's academic stuff, maybe it's psychological stuff, emotional stuff, medical stuff. We've all got that stuff. So being able to personalize, that's the goal. I don't know how we get there. People have been predicting for 100 years that we'd be there by now. We're not even close. I feel like I have tried to answer your question, and at the same time did not answer not one of those 6 parts to it at the same time, but I gave it my best effort.
I'll jump in for a second and just talk about, like, building on what you said. I absolutely agree with you. And I think that if we're all doing the best that we could for all kids, we wouldn't need gifted education. We wouldn't need this identification. We wouldn't need any of what we're all impassioned to do, only because it doesn't exist in our schools without our efforts. So one of the things that I try to do, and I try to emphasize this with everybody I talk to, except that I've got the advantage of being in a fairly large district with 47 schools. So we can create a continuum of services where kids can move in and out of whatever classrooms and programs based on their need. And that really, it boils down to informing our staffs, our teachers, what to look for in these types of things. But as far as the twice exceptionality, there are so many of our gifted kids who are exceptional. And if we put barriers and say, well, you're not achieving at this level, or you don't look like this, or you don't act like this, then you don't get to be in gifted. Well, that's obviously the reason. Now, in my district, I have actually it's called a uniquely gifted program for twice exceptional kids. And I know that's very, very rare, but they move in and out of our other gifted programs too, cluster and self-contained and honors and this and that. So what I'm saying is that we need to be flexible and see who these kids are, like, you know, all of the panelists have said today, and then not be so stringent on our parameters or our policies on who gets in and who doesn't. Once again, I always call it the dilemma of the chicken or the egg, what comes first? Well, in gifted, a lot of times we have this fantastic gifted program and we cherry pick the kids who are going to do well in that program, where the opposite approach, look who are smart, might not be achieving, who are particularly, those are the ones that concern me the most, who are the ones who are really smart but not achieving, then figure out what we could do with that. I say turn that part around.
Okay, Norma, what about another question?
I think we have time for one more question before we go to the last prompt, I think.
I was thinking the same.
Imagine that. How do we, this is from Lenora Crabtree. How do we develop policies and advance regulations that hold schools and districts accountable to address disproportionality in gifted ed and advanced courses?
I just see everyone wanting to speak to that.
I think Marcia's saying something.
Sorry.
Oh, there she is.
There we go. I hit the button. I know from our own review of policy that policy alone isn't enough. We can have funding, we can have policy, full policy and full funding and still have inequity. So when policy is put into place, the policy has to say equitable. And the first place to start with that is to examine one's own data. How equitable are we? And not to be afraid of that. It shouldn't be don't ask, don't tell. You're not going to be equitable, but if you know where you are, then you can fix it. And we have turned a blind eye to it. We've said, yeah, but we have these kids who are really smart and they need services, so it doesn't matter. And so we've created this chasm, the achievement gap, if you will, haves and have-nots. These kids get identified, these don't, the gap widens. And part of that is a general ed solution. And another piece of the policy might be that in general ed, instead of focusing on weaknesses, we focus on strengths. I mean, I know and Dina, you know this, in a cluster grouping model, it isn't necessarily the key to the model success isn't that you train the teachers who are going to work with the highest achievers. It's that every teacher in the building is a cluster teacher, and you train every teacher in gifted education pedagogy, which is strength-based education. And then when you walk down the hallway, it isn't like, oh, there's the gifted class, they're doing all the cool stuff, and here's everybody else's class who are doing the basics. Every classroom looks as if it is a gifted education classroom. And the closer we approximate our practices to that, the more opportunities there are for talent to emerge. It isn't a you're in or you're out. It's a continuum, as Dina said, of focus on what kids are good at. I mean, imagine, I don't know, that's where I would be. Policy has to hold people accountable for equity and hold people accountable for practice, and then provide resources and training so that teachers can be successful in those realms.
And wouldn't this be lovely? And that's what we're all thinking about and working toward. The very last prompt for us is the opportunity for each panelist to provide advice based on our conversation. And Dina, I'm going to start with you this time.
Okay, so some of the best advice I have is borrowed from a friend of mine, Christina Henry Collins. And at one of our recent board meetings, we were talking, she's on the governance committee with me, and we were talking about the Jedi approach. And so I want to just expand on that a little bit, because we throw a lot of terms out in our field. And I'm just wondering think about what those look like in regards to gifted education. So when we talk about the Jedi approach, let's look about that as related to gifted identification services. So justice, J. Social justice means explicitly creating procedures that make gifted programs equitable, inclusive, and honor diversity. Equity in gifted programming evaluates and finds the best ways to minimize underrepresentation and create processes for identifying and serving underserved populations. Diversity means being included in a school's gifted services, identification procedures, and programming options. And inclusion is being asked to contribute to specific and meaningful procedures that invite and honor diversity. Now I'm going to share with you, and I timed this, 2 minutes, a Jedi conversation toward providing gifted services. So, and I created this based on this, some work from Dafina Lazarus Stewart, and it says, so a Jedi conversation for providing gifted services. Diversity asks, who's in our gifted programs? Equity responds, who's trying to get into the gifted program but can't? Whose ability is not even recognized for admittance into our gifted programs? Inclusion asks, has everyone's strengths been noticed? Justice responds, whose strengths won't be taken seriously because they aren't in the majority? Diversity asks, how many of any marginalized group do we have more than last year? Equity responds, what conditions have we created that maintain certain groups as a perpetual majority here? Inclusion asks, is this environment safe for everybody to feel like they belong? And justice challenges, whose well-being is being sacrificed and minimized to allow others to be more comfortable maintaining their views? Diversity asks, isn't it separatist to provide funding in safe places and then separate students? And equity answers, what are people experiencing in our schools that isolate them and make them feel separated from others who are intellectually like themselves? I think we all need to personally look at our own thoughts, approaches, and practices and answer some of those questions.
Those questions really resonate with all of us. Thank you, Dina. Scott, what advice would you like to leave us with?
I think I'll give kind of a big thing and then kind of a smaller thing or a more local thing. The big thing is, Marcia's really highlighted, well, actually Marcia and Jonathan have both really highlighted kind of the limitations to policy, and that when you just get a policy passed or implemented, it doesn't necessarily mean the work is done. One of the things I think, because this week I was actually reading, excuse me, and providing some feedback on Cory Booker's bill, and I was really trying to think about how it would be implemented and okay, could schools get away with doing this, or could they get away with that? And so to make effective policy, you have to provide both really attractive carrots for schools to do what you want, but also sticks so that they can't, go off the rails. And, that's one of the problems with some gifted ed funding. I mean, North Carolina, they basically took their gifted ed funding and just spent it on whatever they wanted, because there wasn't very strict accountability. So if we're going to have policies that are specific to equity, to really making sure that it's incentivized, where it's in the district's interest, not that we should have to do this, but I digress, that it's in their interest to improving equity, and that any financial incentives or releases from other accountability or something that we're providing them would be detrimental if they were to back away from it. The thing on the more micro level, I was on the City of Madison Early Childhood Committee for about 6 years, and this was a committee that was in charge of trying to provide greater access to early childhood education for low-income families in the greater Dane County area. And it was a really big learning experience for me, hearing about different providers in different communities of what they needed. And I think this kind of relates to the article I was talking about from Jean earlier, is that it is very easy, and especially for someone that's, that's got letters after their name, to forget, I think, the things that we don't know, and to start thinking about, oh, I've got research on an effect size that says this and all that things, when you can very often get information that is just as effective for policymaking, and also, more, dare I say, just or righteous, by going into a community and asking them what they need, by what would help them. And the reason I say this is because we found out that all this stuff that we were doing to provide access for childcare, our Spanish-speaking families had no interest in it, because they wanted family-based care. They wanted to have cares that were in homes. They had no interest in centers whatsoever. And everyone in the room was like, really? We've spent decades putting all these standards in place to make care outstanding in these centers and everything. And they were like, yeah, we don't want that. And I think that's just something to always remember with regard to policy, is who you're making it for, the things you don't know, the people you're trying to serve, and just always approaching it from a standpoint of kind of humility and grace. Yeah, and if there's anything that should be part of being an academic, it's being comfortable with the things that you don't know. But yeah, I think enfranchising the people who it is actually your job to serve is a big one.
Such important information to remember. Jonathan?
Thank you, Julia. I forgot what I was going to say because I was so into thinking about what Dina and Scott just said. I've provided plenty of advice, so let me just give a couple very quick closing thoughts. First, I do want to thank Norma and Joy and their colleagues. Having an annual policy get together is so important for the field. I think we should have multiple of them every year, but the fact that we know we've always got this one high quality policies symposium where we can bring these issues front and center is the field will not advance without groups like this putting these events on. So again, thank you. I want to call people's attention to a couple different things. One, a lot of the problems that we're talking about are societal problems. And while I do believe teachers are superheroes, I'm married to one, we don't have superpowers all the time. We can't solve poverty, for example. So we need to do everything that we can, but that doesn't mean we ever take our foot off the gas of essentially answering the question, why does this country of all countries have one of the most hands-off policy environments for lowering child poverty? Why is our child poverty rate so damn high in the richest country the world has ever seen? It's just inexcusable. And the fact that 70, 80 years ago, actually it wasn't even that long, right? 50, 60 years ago, we decided that elder poverty was no longer acceptable. So we put specific policy things in place and we constantly tinker with them. And we have driven elderly poverty from almost a certainty for all of us to like 4 or 5%, still too high. but it's come down like 30 or 40%. That's a huge policy victory. Other countries don't assume that kids have to be poor. This country does, Italy does, Japan does. We have those are the 3 countries with the weakest policies. I'm sure almost none of you know about this, but in President Biden's COVID relief bill, he is talking about fundamentally changing the child tax credit. If that passes, most conservative estimates are it will cut childhood poverty in this country by 50%. It will be the biggest social bill most of us have seen in our entire lifetimes. Yes, education, let's do the best we can. But the social policy side, I do think we're really close to changing public perception about the fact that, hey, some kids are just poor, which has really been the American attitude for generations now. You know, they don't have to be that way. We're so close. You do that with lots of the policy changes that we're talking over here, both short and long term, that is going to save millions of kids' lives. It will transform this country. So just don't take our foot off the gas on education policy, but also those companion social policies. My last point, and this is just a hand grenade I'll drop and then stop, but local norms is not just an identification strategy. It's a philosophy about advanced education. And so I think a lot of our discussion tonight, and I've done it too, we've talked about it as just an identification strategy. It's become shorthand for so much more than that, about keeping services close to students in their neighborhoods, in their schools, community centers. So I would just caution us not to be a bit too reductionist with it. So thank you.
A lot to think about. Marcia, what are your closing bits of advice?
Yeah, what they said. Dina, fabulous. I love your dialogue. And with regard to local norms, even local group norms, I mean, if we have a school, and I usually tell the story, I was working in an urban district to solve racial inequity. And this district had, I'm making this up, say 20 elementary schools. And one of the schools was in the shadow of a very famous research institution where 47% of the children were gifted. And they had 3 enrichment specialists in that school. And I drove 5 miles to the east, and there was a school in the projects that had about 500 African-American kids, all of whom ate free and reduced lunch. And I don't want to conflate poverty and race, because if you're African-American, it doesn't matter what your income is, you're underrepresented in gifted education. But that particular school was all Black and all poor. And there were 2 children identified based on the state standards for gifted education in that school, and they had no services. And I would say that that school probably needed the enrichment specialist more than the school that had 3 with 47 kids, 47% of the kids identified. And I wondered what made that school, why weren't their kids identified? Well, because the state required national norms. And so none of the kids met the norms, and it was a function of child poverty. Maybe, and to some degree, race and disparate scores and cultural norms on the tests and so forth. But there are just as many kids with high potential in the school with 500 kids and 2 identified as there are with the school with 47% of the children identified, and we don't do that well. So that is a huge issue. And until we begin to examine our data, and I guess my parting thought is take a look at your data. How bad are you, and what do you have to do to change it? Are you dealing with changes in policy that include equity and social justice? Is there anti-racist training? Talent development programs need to be inclusive and woven throughout the fabric of the schools. It's really about changing how schools view what their mission is. It isn't to prep kids for tests, it's to prep kids for being productive members of society. Researchers need to study all students. Test developers need to pay attention to how the tests work with all students, and practitioners should not choose measures that yield disparate results. And we shouldn't use our entire budget trying to develop a perfect identification system, because it's never going to happen. Universal screening, local norms, local group norms, using tests for inclusion, multiple measures, multiple pathways. If you're a practitioner, get rid of your matrix because it just isn't, it isn't working. And I think change starts one person at a time. Information is power. I mean, we released the Access Denied report, and I had a state director not speak to me for 6 months because she didn't like it. She thought the data were bad, but the data are census data, they're federal data, they're reported by every school in the country. And we did descriptive statistics. There wasn't even any voodoo statistics going on. It was just, this is what is. I've had people who have been my mentors tell me to stop working on equity, to do something more important. And I think truly acknowledging a problem is the first step to solving it. Mandates will not do anything, even with funding, except find kids and widen the gap. Gifted education today supports and sustains segregation under the guise that some kids need services while others are best served by the general curriculum, which, by the way, isn't very good. We've perpetuated in this field a system that is viewed as separate but equal, but separate is unequal, and it's leading to the elimination of gifted programs for all students. So I think, you know, my takeaway is that we need to act now, and that the power is within each individual to call it out. I go back to what Kendi says, and he said, you're either racist or you're anti-racist. If you're not speaking up, then you're complicit. And now more than ever, we need to speak up, because we're going to lose the whole field if we aren't more equitable. And and the kids deserve the equity. The kids deserve the social justice. Kids deserve to have their talent recognized and developed, not ignored, and to see gaps widen. So I'll leave it at that.
I think our panel has certainly discussed carefully and thoughtfully the many, many issues we have. There's lots of work to be done. We can't take the foot off the pedal. We can't stop advocating. We must keep equity front and center as we talk about implementing best practices and putting policies in place in gifted education and in education in general. I want to thank each of you for being on the panel. Thank you, Dina. Thank you, Marcia. Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you, Scott. And I want to thank you, Norma and Joy, at your center for making this opportunity possible. We don't talk about policy much. At conferences, if you have a session on policy or advocacy, not many people come because that's not what they're interested in. And trust me, if we don't all get involved in discussing equity and how we put it in place through policy and how we advocate for it, we're in big trouble. And we certainly want to avoid that. Thank you, Norma, and I think you'll close out the session.
Yes, indeed. And it is truly my honor to thank each of you for your wisdom and insight. Julia, thank you for facilitating such excellent ideas. Dina, thank you for raising the charge for us to be at the table and be part of the discussion. Scott, thank you for encouraging us all to support all kids to be as good as they can be. Marcia, yes, let's go turn what we do in schools upside down. I'll help you. And Jonathan, we're ready. Let's make more pie. So thank you all very much for your wisdom, expertise, insights. Thank you to all of our sponsors, our Emerald sponsors, our Ruby sponsors, and we so look forward to seeing you all tomorrow for the identification panel that begins at 1 o'clock with Dr. Teresa Newsom, Dr. Joy Esquierdo, and Dr. Ann Robinson. As my father would have said, sleep fast, everyone. We will see you tomorrow. Thank you again very much.